Get comfortable and let your breathing slow. There's nothing left to do tonight but rest. With the lights low, we'll drift quietly through the hidden years of a secret program few ever knew. If these help you sleep, subscribe. I post a new one every night. On August 28, 1956, a memorandum moved through the internal routing system of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was typed on standard bureau stationery, addressed through proper channels, stamped with the appropriate classification markings, and directed toward field offices whose names appeared on a distribution list that no congressional committee had approved and no federal court had reviewed. The document authorized the opening of a covert domestic counterintelligence program. It did not announce itself as anything unusual. In the language of federal administration, it looked like ordinary business. That memorandum traveled through a bureaucratic system that had been running continuously for more than 30 years. Copies went to the appropriate desks. They were filed in the appropriate cabinets. The program they authorized would continue operating for 15 years, accumulating its own documentation, its own routing slips, its own chain of approvals and rejections, and at no point during those 15 years would any of that documentation be shown to a judge, reviewed by a legislative body, or submitted for any form of institutional oversight outside the Bureau itself. The program began as a piece of paper. It grew into a filing system, and the filing system remained, in its way, almost perfectly quiet. The man whose authorization made the program official was J. Edgar Hoover, who had served as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation since 1924. By 1956, that tenure had already stretched across 32 years and 5 presidencies, long enough that the shape of the Bureau had become in large ways the shape of the man who ran it. Hoover had built its procedures, its culture, its internal hierarchies. He had overseen the construction of its field office network, standardized its reporting formats, and established the practice of routing sensitive operational proposals directly to his office for personal review and approval. The Bureau that sent the 1956 memorandum through its system was an institution that, in its administrative architecture, reflected one man's decades of accumulated decision-making. Field offices across the country submitted their proposals in that same standardized administrative language. An agent in a regional office would compose a disruption proposal on the Bureau's routing documents, recording in careful, measured prose the identity of the target, the proposed method, the anticipated operational outcome, and the resources required. That proposal would travel upward through the chain of approval. It would arrive eventually at Hoover's desk in Washington. He would approve it or reject it. His response would travel back down the same chain. The whole machinery of authorization was concentrated, ultimately, in one signature at the top of a routing slip. What that administrative system was authorizing in 1956 was a program the Bureau designated with an acronym, COINTELPRO. The name itself was internal, bureaucratic, unremarkable, in the way that government program names tend to be unremarkable. It appeared at the top of classification documents. It appeared in routing codes. It identified a category of covert domestic operation that the Bureau would conduct without legal authorization from any external body for a decade and a half. The name would not appear in any newspaper for 15 years. During that time, it existed only inside the filing system that produced and contained it. The political climate of August 1956 had its own particular textures. The Soviet Union had conducted its first successful nuclear weapons test in 1949, 7 years before the memorandum was signed. The Korean War had ended in 1953, 3 years before it, with an armistice rather than a treaty, leaving a permanent division in place. The Senate hearings, chaired by Joseph McCarthy, which had spent years examining what McCarthy characterized as communist infiltration of American institutions, had concluded in 1954, 2 years prior, with McCarthy's censure by the Senate. But the ideological temperature they had helped produce, the specific anxiety about internal subversion, about the possibility that loyalty could not be assumed, about the difficulty of distinguishing a domestic political dissident from an agent of a foreign power, that temperature had not dropped significantly when the hearings ended. If anything, it had become a permanent feature of the institutional landscape. Hoover understood how to operate within that landscape. He had in fact helped to construct it. His bureau had provided investigative support during the McCarthy period. His public statements over many years had characterized communist influence on American civic life as a genuine and present danger. Within this framing, the step from investigating foreign espionage to disrupting domestic political organizations could be presented as something other than a suppression of political speech. It could be presented as a national security necessity. The internal documents of the program frame it, consistently, in those terms. The language of the authorizing memoranda describes targets as threats to national security. It does not describe them as political opponents. The distinction mattered inside the Bureau for how the program understood itself. That distinction between foreign intelligence operations and domestic political surveillance had, within the Bureau's internal framework, been gradually dissolving for years before 1956. The techniques that would be applied through COINTELPRO had not been invented for this program. They had been developed earlier through FBI operations targeting foreign espionage networks operating in the United States during and after the Second World War. The methods of placing informants inside organizations, of intercepting communications, of using disinformation to create internal confusion within a target group, all of these had been refined in the context of counterintelligence work directed at foreign spy networks. When the Bureau adapted those techniques for use against domestic political organizations, it was in some operational sense simply extending a methodology it had already built. Inside the Bureau's administrative framework, the distinction between a foreign agent and an American citizen who held particular political views had by 1956 become more procedural than absolute. The same routing document that recorded a proposal to disrupt the operations of a foreign intelligence network could accommodate, with modest changes to the target description, a proposal to disrupt the operations of a domestic political organization. The mechanics of the program were largely already in place. What the 1956 memorandum created was a formal designation, a program name, and a systematic administrative structure for the covert disruption of American political life, conducted by an American federal agency operating without external oversight of any kind. No act of Congress had authorized the program. This is a documented fact of the program's institutional history, not an inference drawn from later investigation. The Bureau did not seek legislative authorization. It did not submit enabling legislation for congressional review. It did not brief the relevant committees on the existence or scope of its activities. The Senate Judiciary Committee, which held nominal oversight responsibility for the Department of Justice and its agencies, was not informed. Individual senators and representatives were not informed. The entire program existed, for its entire 15-year duration, entirely outside the legislative oversight framework that governs the creation of authorized federal programs. No federal court had reviewed the program's authorization. Warrants had not been sought for many of the operations the program conducted. The specific covert techniques the Bureau employed did not within the Bureau's internal legal assessment during this period require external judicial review. The courts were not presented with the program. No judge had reviewed a COINTELPRO authorization memorandum. The program operated entirely outside the judicial oversight framework as well. The Attorney General, who as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States held nominal supervisory authority over the Bureau, was not kept systematically informed of the program's existence or scope. Successive attorneys general during the COINTELPRO years received limited selective briefings at most. The full picture of what the program was doing, the range of its targets, the specifics of its methods, the volume of its operations, was not assembled into a form that was presented to the Attorney General for review. The Bureau operated the program with a degree of internal autonomy that, in retrospect, the documentary record makes clear, was deliberate. The filing system that held all of this was, in its physical reality, rows of cabinets in federal office buildings. The documents in those cabinets were classified. They were routed on standardized forms. They were assigned program designators. They were organized with the kind of meticulous administrative order that a large bureaucratic institution tends to produce naturally as a function of its own operational culture. To look at the physical documents, and thousands of them would eventually be examined, in circumstances the program's architects did not anticipate, was to see something that resembled, in almost every external feature, the ordinary administrative output of a large government agency conducting its routine business. The language of the documents is itself worth dwelling on. The internal memoranda of COINTELPRO did not, as a rule, describe their operations in terms that would signal the violation of any legal or ethical norm. They described targets, they described proposed methods, they described expected outcomes. They used the vocabulary of operational planning that any large institutional bureaucracy uses when it is organizing a complex activity and wants to track its progress across multiple locations and over multiple years. The word disruption appears in many of the documents. The phrase internal unity appears. The phrase neutralize appears. The administrative register remains consistent throughout. These were not the documents of people who believed they were doing something outside the normal scope of institutional activity. That steadiness of administrative register is part of what makes the documentary record of the program so quietly instructive as a piece of institutional history. The program did not hide itself in unusual language. It described itself, to itself, in the same terms any federal agency uses when describing any authorized program. The classification of the documents kept them from public view, but the documents themselves, in their form and their language, were unremarkable within the Bureau's own institutional culture. They were the product of a filing system that was simply doing what a filing system does, recording decisions, routing approvals, tracking outcomes. Hoover had maintained and extended his personal control over the Bureau across a period spanning 5 presidencies and multiple political eras by the time 1956 arrived. His tenure had begun in 1924 during the administration of Calvin Coolidge, and it would not end until his death in 1972, partway through the Nixon administration. That span covered the Great Depression, the Second World War, the early Cold War, and the major political and social upheavals of the 1960s. Across all of those periods, the Bureau's operational culture had reflected his priorities, his methods, and his particular understanding of what the Bureau's mission was and what kinds of threats warranted its attention. The COINTELPRO Memorandum of August 1956 was one document among many that passed through his office in the 3 decades before and the 16 years after it. He received field proposals. He approved some and rejected others. He communicated his operational priorities through the approval and rejection record. The program was, in a real administrative sense, an extension of his preferences and his judgment, applied systematically across the country through the field office network he had built. When a field agent in a regional office composed a disruption proposal on a standardized routing document, the proposal traveled toward one man's desk, where it would be read, assessed against whatever operational priorities that desk maintained, and approved or returned. The field offices themselves were distributed across the country. Each maintained its own files, its own informant relationships, its own local intelligence picture. The COINTELPRO operations each office conducted were shaped by the specific political landscape of its city or region, the specific organizations active there, the specific individuals whose activities had drawn the Bureau's attention. But the overall operational parameters were set by headquarters, and headquarters meant, in the most practical administrative sense, Hoover's office. The program had a genuine national architecture with consistent methodology applied across geographically dispersed locations, all of it coordinated through a central chain of approval that terminated in one signature. August 1956 was a specific moment in the history of the Cold War's domestic dimension. The Hungarian Revolution would begin 2 months later, in October, producing images that reinforced for many Americans the sense of a world divided along ideological lines in ways that required vigilance and response. The year before, the Warsaw Pact had been formally established. The year before that, the Soviet Union had conducted its first test of a hydrogen bomb. The sense of a sustained, serious geopolitical contest with significant internal implications had been a feature of American public and institutional life since at least 1947, and by 1956 it had settled into something more like a permanent condition than an acute emergency. Institutions operating within that condition developed their own ways of metabolizing it. The Bureau's way included the development of programs that treated the boundary between foreign threat and domestic political activity as a working operational question rather than a fixed legal line. The 1956 memorandum was, in one reading, simply a formalization of a set of practices that had been developing for several years, given a program name and a systematic structure. The formalization mattered. It meant that what had been, in some instances, ad hoc activity could now be organized, tracked, expanded, and subjected to the kind of administrative planning that makes a large-scale institutional effort sustainable over time. 15 years is a considerable duration for a covert program to run. It spans, in ordinary biographical terms, a significant portion of a human life. In institutional terms, 15 years is long enough for a program's methods to become routine, for its administrative culture to normalize its own activities, for the people who work within it to come to understand its operations as simply the work the institution does. The documents suggest that this kind of normalization did occur within the Bureau. The routing forms kept coming, the proposals kept arriving, the approvals kept being issued, the operations kept being conducted and recorded, the filing system kept expanding. The techniques adapted from foreign counterintelligence work did not remain static across those 15 years. They developed. New methods were added to the operational repertoire. Old methods were refined. The administrative record of the program accumulated operational history that later investigators would use to trace the evolution of its methods. But the core of what the program was doing, the covert, unauthorized disruption of the political activities of American citizens and organizations remained consistent across the program's full duration. What the 1956 memorandum had authorized continued in its essential character until the program's formal termination. The specific date of that termination, 1971, is itself part of the documentary record. But between August 1956 and 1971, the filing system operated without interruption. Documents moved through the routing system, proposals were approved, operations were conducted, results were recorded. The administrative machinery generated its own ongoing record of itself in the careful, consistent language of a bureaucratic institution that believed itself to be conducting authorized national security work. In the spring and summer of 1956, before the memorandum was signed, the Bureau had been conducting surveillance of domestic political organizations through mechanisms that were in some respects continuous with what COINTELPRO would formalize. The program's origins are not a sharp break from what preceded them. They are more accurately understood as a structural formalization, a decision to give a consistent name, a consistent administrative framework, and a consistent operational methodology to a set of activities that had been developing within the Bureau for some time. The Memorandum of August 28, 1956, is the moment the program has a name, but the institutional impulses that produced it had been present for longer. The Cold War's ideological framing provided the language the Bureau used to describe its targets. Organizations that maintained political views, the Bureau, associated with communist influence, or with what internal documents characterized as un-American activity, appeared in the program's operational scope in ways that the foreign counterintelligence framework made, internally, legible as national security work. The specific political views held by the members of targeted organizations were, within this framing, relevant to the Bureau's national security mission rather than protected from it. The line between investigating espionage and suppressing political dissent within the Bureau's internal framework during this period was a line the institution had effectively stopped drawing, and is what the filing cabinets held across the 15 years the program operated was the administrative record of that erasure. Each classified document in each federal filing cabinet represented a specific operational decision, a target selected, a method approved, an outcome recorded. The aggregate of those decisions, filed in the standardized administrative language the Bureau used for all its business, was a record of what a large federal institution had concluded it was authorized to do to its own citizens without the knowledge or approval of any court, any legislative body, or, in any systematic sense, any executive oversight. The cabinets themselves were physically unremarkable. Steel, locked, labeled with program codes, arranged in rows in federal office buildings across the country. Documents filed alphabetically or by case number, accessible to authorized personnel, invisible to anyone outside the Bureau. The program they contained had been authorized by a memorandum, sustained by a chain of approvals, and built into the routine administrative output of an institution that had been operating for more than 3 decades. It did not look from the outside like anything at all. From the outside, it was simply absent from view. There is a particular quality to institutional silence of this kind. It is not the silence of something concealed in haste, poorly hidden, likely to be found by anyone who looks carefully. It is the silence of something organized from the beginning in a way that keeps it within a closed system, accessible only through that system's own internal authorization mechanisms. The COINTELPRO documents were not hidden under floors or kept in private locations. They were filed, properly, in federal filing cabinets, under program designators, in the ordinary administrative order of the Bureau's record-keeping system. Their inaccessibility was structural, not physical. They were exactly where they were supposed to be. They simply required a security clearance that no outside investigator, no congressional staffer, no journalist, and no judge had ever been authorized to hold. The program that a single signed memorandum set in motion on August 28, 1956, would, over its 15 years, produce a documentary record that filled those cabinets across multiple field offices and the central repository at Bureau headquarters. That record would eventually leave the filing system, carried out in ways the program's architects had not planned for, read in courtrooms and hearing rooms and newspaper offices by people who had not previously known the program existed. But in 1956, and through the years that followed, the record sat where it had been placed, organized and classified, and inaccessible in the quiet institutional dark of federal filing cabinets that no one outside the Bureau had ever been authorized to open. The administrative infrastructure of a large federal agency has a particular kind of persistence. Once a program is given a name and a filing structure and a chain of approval, it tends to continue unless something actively terminates it. The proposal arrives at the desk. The approval issues from the desk. The operation is conducted. The result is filed. The next proposal arrives. Nothing in the system itself generates the friction required to stop the cycle. The filing cabinets accept each new document. The routing slips travel their designated paths. The program names persist at the top of classification markings, and the operations the documents describe continue in their methodical, routinized way for as long as the authorization structure that produced the first memorandum remains intact. What August 28, 1956 began, in the most concrete administrative sense, was a filing system, a program name, a chain of approval, and a set of classified folders waiting to receive the documents that the program would generate across the years that followed. The individuals who appeared in those documents as targets had no knowledge of the folders that held their names. The organizations whose activities the program sought to disrupt had no legal mechanism to challenge an authorization that no court had reviewed. The program operated in the silence that a closed administrative system can maintain for a very long time simply by being organized correctly and kept within its own institutional walls. The filing cabinets of the Cold War-era federal government were, in their way, among the most consequential pieces of furniture in the country. What was inside them and what was not, what had been authorized, recorded, and filed, and what had been kept from the filing systems that might have checked it, was a kind of ongoing national record of institutional decision-making that no one outside those institutions was reading. In 1956, the year the COINTELPRO memorandum was signed, classified, routed, filed, and quietly carried forward by the system that had produced it, the cabinets went on holding what they held in the ordinary institutional dark of a federal building on an ordinary working day, with no particular sign on the outside that anything inside was worth examining. A federal courtroom record established in 1986 that the Socialist Workers' Party had been under FBI surveillance for a span equivalent to more than 20,000 days. That number, read from a legal document in a courtroom, translates into something concrete when held against ordinary time. 20,000 days is roughly 55 years. It is mornings and evenings stretching back before most of the people in any given room were born. For the Socialist Workers' Party, it meant that across the decades between the late 1930s and the point at which a federal judge examined the record, agents had been watching, counting, entering, and documenting. The court awarded the party $264,000 in damages, and the sum itself is less remarkable than what the court had to examine to arrive at it. The Socialist Workers' Party had been founded in 1938, a Trotskyist political organization with a relatively small membership compared to the broader landscape of American political life. Its members ran candidates, published newspapers, held meetings, and conducted the ordinary procedural work of an organization operating inside a democratic system. During the period the court eventually examined, FBI agents entered the party's offices more than 200 times without warrants, on occasions documented but not disclosed to any court at the time they occurred. Or known you take to them. Agents photographed internal documents, correspondence, membership materials, and records that the party kept in the ordinary course of its operations. Each entry was made and departed before morning. The agents left no trace of their presence that party members were meant to find, and none of those entries appeared in any public record for years after they occurred. The informant count the court eventually considered stood at approximately 1,000. Those were individuals who had joined the organization, attended its meetings, participated in its discussions, and reported what they observed back to bureau handlers. 1,000 informants across the span of a single organization represents a particular kind of attention, thorough and sustained, and invisible from the inside. Members of the party who attended meetings during those years had no reliable way of knowing which of the people in the room were filing reports. The party continued to function, to publish, to organize. The surveillance continued around and through it, in a parallel administrative record accumulating in a federal filing system. Martin Luther King Jr. first became a significant focus of FBI attention during the Montgomery bus boycott, which began in December of 1955 and concluded with a Supreme Court ruling that segregated seating on public buses was unconstitutional. Hoover authorized the placement of wiretaps on King's home telephone following the boycott, and as King's organizational reach expanded through the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the surveillance expanded with it. Wiretaps were placed on office phones, hotel room telephones at locations where King was scheduled to stay were also tapped. The surveillance followed him from city to city, from one speaking engagement to the next, from one meeting to the next, each location logged in a headquarters file that grew steadily larger across the years. Internal memoranda from that period describe King in language that was bureaucratic in form but unambiguous in meaning. Hoover characterized him in at least one internal document as the most dangerous Negro in America. That phrase appeared not in a public statement, not in testimony before a court, but in a memorandum routed through an internal chain of authority within the Bureau. It was a classification written in the administrative register of an organization that processed targets and assessments and operational goals in the same documentary language used for filing schedules and budget approvals. The phrase sat in a file. The surveillance it reflected continued. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference itself was an organization of affiliated churches and civil rights groups working in the American South during a period of sustained and often violent resistance to desegregation. Its campaigns included voter registration drives, legal challenges to segregation, and organized nonviolent demonstrations. These activities were lawful. No member of the SCLC had been charged with espionage or sedition. The legal basis for the surveillance of the organization and its chairman was never reviewed by any federal court during the years the surveillance was conducted, and the surveillance was not disclosed to the individuals being watched. In September of 1968, J. Edgar Hoover signed a memorandum that formally designated the Black Panther Party as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. The Black Panther Party had been founded in Oakland, California in October of 1966 by Huey P. Pling, Newton, and Bobby Seale, and by 1968 it had established chapters in cities across the country. The organization ran community programs, including breakfast programs for children in low-income neighborhoods, and published a newspaper with a substantial circulation. It also maintained a position on armed self-defense that generated sustained attention from law enforcement at the local, state, and federal level. The September 1968 memorandum was not a declaration made in public. It was an internal document that redirected resources. The classification of the Black Panther Party as the country's greatest internal security threat, stated in a memorandum bearing Hoover's authority, had the effect of accelerating the deployment of informants, surveillance operations, and coordination with local police departments across the cities where the organization had chapters. The memorandum was a bureaucratic instrument that changed allocation. It moved people and attention and operational planning toward a specific set of targets in Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and elsewhere, in the same administrative way that any resource allocation decision moves things within a large institutional structure. The chapters that existed across those cities were distinct organizations with their own local memberships and local leaders. They shared a name and a set of positions and a general alignment, but they were not a single unified command structure with perfect internal communications. The surveillance that the September 1968 designation accelerated treated them as a coordinated threat requiring coordinated attention. Files opened, informants were placed, and the documentation accumulated in regional and central offices, none of it visible to the members of the organizations being watched. The American Indian Movement was founded in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in July of 1968 by Dennis Banks, Clyde Belcourt, Peeve, and several others in response to conditions of poverty, police brutality, and the dislocation experienced by Native American communities who had relocated to urban centers under a federal relocation program that had begun in the early 1950s. AIM organized street patrols to monitor interactions between police and Native residents, and over the years that followed it, expanded its scope and visibility, eventually organizing events of national significance and taking positions on treaty rights, land, and sovereignty. The formal COINTEL program was terminated in 1971 following the exposure of internal bureau documents. The surveillance and disruption activities directed at AIM did not end at the same point. In the spring of 1973, members of the American Indian Movement and Oglala Lakota residents of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota occupied the town of Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre of Lakota people by the United States Army. The occupation lasted 71 days and drew national attention. Federal marshals and FBI agents were present during the standoff. In the years that followed, documentation indicated that surveillance and disruption tactics consistent with those used during the COINTELPRO years had continued against AIM's leadership and membership, well beyond the program's official termination date. The trail of broken treaties march in 1972, during which AIM members and other activists traveled to Washington, D.C. to present a set of demands regarding treaty rights, was also documented in surveillance records. Those records continued to accumulate in federal files long after the march itself had ended. AIM members who traveled to Washington in 1972 did so in a caravan that wound through cities and reservation communities on the way to the Capitol. They arrived at the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, which they occupied for several days before negotiations produced a settlement of sorts, and the occupation ended. Their journey, their organization, the individuals who participated, the communications they exchanged along the way, these things were being documented in surveillance files that neither they nor their attorneys had any knowledge of at the time. The documentation persisted. Files that had been opened continued to accumulate material. What the records showed was that the administrative attention directed at AIM did not follow the same timeline as the program, whose methods it shared. The Young Lords emerged in New York City in 1969, building from a street organization in Chicago that had been founded several years earlier. The New York chapter established itself in the neighborhood of East Harlem and organized around conditions that affected the Puerto Rican community in the city: sanitation, healthcare, housing, and the experiences of Puerto Rican residents within institutions, including hospitals and prisons. The organization published a newspaper, Palante, whose name was taken from a Spanish expression meaning forward or onward. The paper documented the organization's positions, its campaigns, its internal discussions of political theory, and its reporting on conditions in East Harlem and beyond. It was read by members and by community residents, distributed through the neighborhoods where the Young Lords were active. The FBI's files on the Young Lords included the newspaper. Copies were acquired, filed, and treated as intelligence material. The language the paper used, the names of the people who wrote for it, the specific positions it took on political and community questions, these things were recorded in documents that accumulated in a federal surveillance file. Alongside the newspaper, FBI documents concerning the Young Lords included reporting from informants who had been placed inside the organization, monitoring personal conflicts between members and within the leadership, internal disagreements, personal relationships, individual grievances that existed within the organization as they exist within any human group. These were identified and recorded, and the records were kept in the same administrative system that held files on the Socialist Workers' Party and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Black Panther Party. The Young Lords' offices were in a community where the organization was visible and active. The people who came to those offices, who attended the organization's events, who contributed to the newspaper, or worked in the community programs the organization ran, were residents of that neighborhood. They were not intelligence operatives. They were members of an organization that had not been charged with any crime and had not been reviewed by any court. They had no knowledge of the file accumulating in federal offices while they went about the work of the organization they had joined. Across all of the organizations that appeared on these lists, a consistent administrative pattern held. A target was identified and classified. Surveillance was authorized by a routing document moving through internal channels. Field agents assigned to the target began reporting. Informants were recruited and placed. Files were opened and maintained. The documentation was bureaucratic in form and thorough in execution, and none of it passed through a judicial review process during the years it was being produced. The individuals named in those files had no legal mechanism by which they could discover that a file on them existed, or that the file contained specific characterizations, specific reports from informants, specific conclusions drawn by analysts inside the Bureau. The Socialist Workers' Party knew. Eventually, the federal court that heard its case in 1986 produced a ruling that placed the specific figures, 20,000 days of surveillance, more than 200 illegal entries, approximately 1,000 informants, into a public legal record. The court's damage award of $264,000 translated years of systematic documentation into a sum of money, paid decades after the entries had been made, and the informants had filed their reports, and the files had grown thick with the accumulated detail of a political organization going about its business. The ruling confirmed facts that the organization's members had suspected and later documented through legal discovery, but which had not existed in a public record during the years the surveillance was occurring. The span of time between the surveillance and its legal reckoning is one of the things that the record shows most plainly. Events occurred in one decade. Documentation was made in the same decade it described. The legal process that produced a public accounting began years later and concluded many years after that. By the time a court examined what had happened to the Socialist Workers' Party, some of the agents who had entered its offices without warrants had retired. Some of the informants who had attended its meetings had moved on to other lives. The files that recorded all of these things had been sitting in federal filing systems throughout, available to Bureau personnel and to no one else. Martin Luther King Jr., Kazastork no Lucier, Tefarshinen, Kazavdu, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in December of 1964. He traveled to Oslo to receive it. The FBI's surveillance of him continued through his travel and his time abroad. The files that accumulated during those weeks were filed and maintained alongside the files from every other period of the surveillance. The Poldal Oslo recordings and monitoring logged in the same administrative registers as the records from Montgomery and Atlanta and Chicago and every other city where King had been watched. The Nobel Prize ceremony did not alter the Bureau's assessment or its operational posture toward him. King was killed on April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. The files that had been kept on him during the years of surveillance did not close at that point in any meaningful operational sense. Materials continued to be processed, assessments continued to be filed, and the administrative apparatus that had followed him from city to city and hotel room to hotel room persisted, carrying the documentation of years forward into the record. The September 1968 Hoover Memorandum designating the Black Panther Party as the greatest internal security threat was signed 4 months after King's death. The acceleration it produced in resources and operations directed at the Black Panther Party's chapters happened in a political moment already shaped by assassination, by urban uprisings in cities across the country, by the ongoing war in Vietnam, and by the specific anxieties that Hoover had been articulating in internal memoranda for years. Those contextual facts were part of the administrative environment in which the memorandum was written and received. The chapters in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York were targets operating within that environment, unaware of the September classification that had made them a higher priority. The files on the young lords at FBI headquarters in New York City occupied physical space. Documents were received, processed, labeled, and placed in folders. The folders were labeled and placed in a filing system. The system was maintained by administrative staff whose work was the ordinary work of a large bureaucratic organization, receiving incoming material, routing it to the appropriate location, maintaining the integrity of the record. The Young Lord's newspaper, Palante, was somewhere in that system. Copies were there alongside internal reports and informant communications and analyst assessments and whatever other materials the surveillance had produced. The paper had been written and printed and distributed by people who understood it as a community resource and a political document. In a federal office, it was an exhibit. AIM members who had traveled to Washington, who had participated in the occupation at Wounded Knee, who had attended organizational meetings in Minneapolis or on the Pine Ridge Reservation, or in cities where the organization had established a presence, appeared by name in documents that were filed and maintained in federal surveillance records. Those records did not close when the Wounded Knee occupation ended. They did not close when the formal COINTELPRO program was terminated. They persisted in the administrative system that had produced them, available to Bureau personnel and to the law enforcement agencies with which the Bureau had established working relationships, and not available to the individuals they described. The breadth of the list is what the documents, read together, reveal most clearly. It included a Trotskyist political party, a civil rights organization centered in black churches in the American South, a black nationalist organization with community programs and a newspaper, an indigenous rights organization founded in a Minneapolis neighborhood, and a Puerto Rican activist organization working in East Harlem. These organizations shared the fact of appearing on lists that their members had not seen and that no court had reviewed. They did not otherwise share a political framework, a geographic location, a membership base, or a particular organizational form. The surveillance that was directed at each of them drew from the same set of administrative tools and the same chain of authorization applied to groups that were distinct in their composition and their concerns and their histories. The federal court ruling that produced the figures for the Socialist Workers' Party came in 1986. The surveillance that the ruling described had been ongoing for decades before that. The gap between the occurrence of the events and the legal record that eventually named them is not unusual in cases of this kind. It is rather characteristic. The documentation that made the 1986 ruling possible existed because of legal proceedings initiated in 1973, which themselves became possible only after 1971, when internal Bureau documents were first distributed publicly and made the existence of systematic programs a matter that could be addressed through legal channels. The court's ruling was the end of a long chain. The surveillance at the beginning of that chain was ordinary bureaucratic activity that had been occurring in a classified filing system for years before anyone outside the Bureau knew to ask about it. The Young Lords newspaper continued to be published while FBI files in New York held copies of its earlier issues. The paper's contributors were writing about East Harlem and about the political positions the organization held, and somewhere in the federal record, their names were attached to documents that classified their activity as something requiring monitoring. There is a particular quality to that simultaneity, the work being done and the documentation of the work accumulating in a separate place, unknown to the people whose work it documented. It is not dramatic in any single instance. It is the steady, consistent parallel operation of two very different kinds of record, one made by people going about their lives in a community, and one made by a federal institution that had classified the same lives as a security concern. The SCLC's campaigns moved through the American South from one city to the next in the late 1950s and the 1960s. Birmingham, Selma, Albany, St. Augustine, each location was a place where the organization organized, faced resistance, and continued. The wiretaps that had been authorized followed the organization's leadership. Hotel room phones in cities that the leadership visited were tapped before their arrival. The technical work of placing and monitoring those taps was carried out by agents who filed reports on the content of the calls, and those reports traveled back to a central file at headquarters. The file grew, the campaigns continued. Neither thing was visible to the other. The Black Panther Party's community breakfast program operated in church halls and community centers in Oakland and Chicago and other cities. Children arrived in the mornings to eat before school. The program was run by party members and required ongoing logistical work, acquiring food, coordinating with the churches and centers that hosted the meals, showing up every morning and doing the work of feeding children. The people doing that work were also, by September 1968, the subjects of a federal designation calling them the greatest internal security threat in the country. Those two things existed at the same time: the morning routine of preparing and serving food, and the federal classification that redirected resources toward monitoring and disrupting the organization. Those same people had joined. The AIM surveillance files that accumulated through the 1970s included material gathered before, during, and after the Wounded Knee occupation. The occupation ended in May of 1973. The federal presence that had been assembled around it dispersed. AIM members returned to their communities. The surveillance apparatus that had been directed at the organization did not stand down in the same way. The files continued to receive material, and the relationship between the Bureau and AIM, as reflected in those files, continued through the mid-1970s, in a form that bore the clear marks of the operational methods the earlier program had established. There is a filing cabinet in this picture, or rather many of them, in many offices across the country. The Socialist Workers' Party's file is in one of them. Martin Luther King Jr.'s file is in another. The Black Panther Party's organizational file is in a field office in Chicago, and in Los Angeles, and in New York, and at headquarters in Washington. The Young Lords file is in New York. AIM's file is in Minneapolis and in Washington, and in the files generated by the agents who had been present at Wounded Knee. These cabinets are not together in a single room. They are distributed across the administrative geography of a large federal institution, each one filed and labeled and maintained by people whose daily work was the maintenance of the record. The record did not announce itself. It sat in the cabinets, available to those who had clearance to open them, and nowhere else. The 1986 court ruling that named the Socialist Workers' Party's surveillance in specific terms is a public document. It was entered into the legal record, and it can be read now by anyone who looks for it. It arrived at the end of a long chain of legal proceedings, and it placed into public view the figures that had existed in classified files for years before the proceedings began. The damages it awarded translated the surveillance into a sum that could be written on a check, and the check was written. The records that the ruling described remained in federal archives, much of them eventually made available through the Freedom of Information Act and through the discovery processes of the legal cases that had been filed over the years. The list of organizations that the files described is long. The ones considered here are among the most thoroughly documented. There were others: peace organizations, student groups, organizations working around labor and housing and immigration, smaller and less well-known groups that also appeared in files maintained by field offices across the country. The people whose names appeared in those files had joined organizations they found meaningful, contributed to newspapers they believed were worth publishing, attended meetings they considered important, and gone home. What they had not done was know about the file. The file was being kept in a different place, under different authority, by people whose job was to keep it, and the keeping of it was work that could continue for decades without any outside review. A federal records office in New York, on an ordinary working day in 1969 or 1970, would have received new material concerning the Young Lords. A document would have been processed and placed in a folder. The folder would have been returned to its location in the filing system. The work of maintaining the record would have continued. In East Harlem, on the same day, someone would have been working on the next issue of Palante, writing or editing or preparing the paper for distribution. These two activities were occurring in the same city on the same day, in complete ignorance of each other from the side of the newspaper and in the service of two entirely different understandings of what the newspaper and the people who made it represented. The record that accumulated across these files, read together, covers a substantial portion of the organized political life of the American left across several decades. The surveillance was not random in its targets. It was systematic, authorized and maintained by an institution with the administrative capacity to sustain it over long periods without external review. The targets were selected because the Bureau had assessed them as threats, and the assessment was made inside the Bureau, by the Bureau, and shared outside the Bureau, primarily in forms that served the Bureau's operational goals, rather than in forms that invited outside scrutiny. The targets did not get to see the assessments. They did not get to contest them. They continued their work, and the files continued to grow. In a federal records office in New York City, at some point in those years, a copy of Palante was filed alongside informant reports and analyst assessments, and the other materials that made up the young lord's surveillance file. The paper had been written and printed in East Harlem, intended for the community it served, and the movement it was part of. It arrived in that file and stayed there, in a folder, in a cabinet, in an office, in a building, quietly becoming part of a record that its contributors had never seen, and that a great many communities across the country, whose organizations were similarly documented, had no knowledge of at all. An FBI agent is sitting at a desk with an intelligence report open in front of him. The report contains notes gathered over weeks, observations from a paid informant who had attended the organization's meetings, fragments of private conversation logged and filed, details about a personal conflict between two members that had developed quietly over several months. The agent's task, as recorded in the internal authorization for the operation, is to accelerate that conflict. He is composing a letter. The letter will not carry his name. It will not carry any name that could be traced to a federal building or a government salary. The language he is choosing is drawn from the intelligence notes, specific enough to read as someone who had been in the room, personal enough to carry the weight of a genuine grievance, calibrated to land with the force of something true, even though the handwriting, it had never attended a single meeting of the organization it describes. When the letter is finished, it will be placed in an envelope, addressed in handwriting that is not his professional signature, and sent to a member of the targeted group who has no knowledge of the federal infrastructure that produced the text they are about to read. The internal memoranda that authorized operations of this kind described the goal in language that was administrative and precise, creating factionalism, disrupting the internal unity of target groups. The agents who carried the operations out were not working from personal hostility toward the people they were writing about. They were completing assignments documented on routing slips, recorded in field reports, reviewed by supervisors, and filed in a classified system. The paperwork surrounding each anonymous letter was, in its own way, thorough. This was one method among several. Each method had its own operational logic, its own paperwork trail, and its own category within the Bureau's internal framework for describing what the program was doing and why. Taken together, they formed a set of practices that had been adapted from foreign counterintelligence work. The same approaches used to disrupt networks operated by foreign governments inside American borders, now applied to domestic organizations whose members had not been charged with any crime and whose activities, in most cases, included writing newspapers, organizing meetings, and making speeches. The anonymous letter was perhaps the most widely deployed tool across the program's active years. Agents in field offices around the country prepared and mailed correspondence that accused specific individuals of being informants alleged financial misconduct by organizational leaders, described supposed extramarital affairs, or reported internal conflicts that had been embellished or manufactured from partial intelligence. The text was designed to read as if it came from someone inside, a disillusioned member, a concerned ally, a person who had seen something and decided to say so. The effect, when it worked as intended, was that the recipient had no reason to question the letter's origin and every reason to act on its contents. A letter of this kind, arriving in the mailbox of a chapter leader or a rank-and-file member, could accomplish several things at once. It could direct suspicion toward an individual who was in fact loyal to the organization and had no connection to federal surveillance. It could create the impression that financial records were being mishandled, prompting internal audits or accusations that consumed organizational energy and produced distrust among people who had previously worked closely together. It could cause a leader to be questioned or isolated. It could produce, in a group that had been functioning cohesively, the specific kind of doubt that is difficult to resolve because its source cannot be located and its claims cannot be easily disproved. None of this required the FBI agent who composed the letter to appear at any meeting, make any phone call, or identify himself in any way. The disruption arrived through the ordinary postal system in an envelope indistinguishable from personal correspondence, and the operational trail it left behind existed only in the classified files of the program that had sent it. The use of informants added a different dimension to the program's reach. Paid individuals recruited by the Bureau joined targeted organizations as apparently sincere members, attending meetings, participating in discussions, building relationships with other members over months and sometimes years. Their field reports traveled back to FBI headquarters, carrying with them the content of private conversations, the details of organizational planning, the names and personal circumstances of people who believed they were among allies. What the intelligence reports described, in the measured language of agent filing, was the interior of a community as seen from inside it. In a number of documented cases, the role of the informant extended beyond observation and reporting. Bureau records show that in some instances, individuals working as informants participated in organizational decisions in ways that served FBI disruption goals, advocating for particular courses of action, encouraging divisions that already existed, or providing the kind of guidance that, coming from what appeared to be a trusted member, would carry weight in a deliberation. The line between reporting on an organization and actively shaping it from inside was, in practice, not consistently maintained. A person sitting in one of these meetings, contributing to decisions about how the group should proceed, who they should trust, what their next public action should be, was performing membership in a way that other members had no means of distinguishing from the genuine article. The techniques here are not ones that require detailed description. What matters is the function, an individual present in a room where decisions are being made, whose actual loyalties and actual reporting lines are unknown to everyone else in that room, occupies a position that can alter what the organization does without leaving a visible mark on how the decision was reached. The payment records for informants were maintained in the Bureau's standard administrative system. A $300 bonus, a weekly or monthly stipend, expenses logged against a field office budget. These were processed through the same internal accounting structures that handled any other operational expenditure. The people being paid appeared in these records as assets, identified in some cases by number rather than name. Their compensation documented in the same registers that recorded the costs of vehicle maintenance or office supplies. Forgery represented a third category of method. Bureau agents prepared documents made to appear as if written by organizational leaders or issued on official organizational stationery, letters that carried the apparent authority of a known voice addressed to rival groups or to individuals whose relationship with the targeted organization the Bureau wished to damage. The intent, as internal memoranda described it, was to provoke hostility between groups that the Bureau classified as threatening, or to cause a specific figure to appear to have said or done something that would reduce their standing or bring them into conflict with others. A forged letter of this kind was not a clumsy document. The agents who produced these materials had access to organizational publications, correspondence samples, and intelligence reports that gave them detailed knowledge of how specific leaders wrote, what concerns they typically raised, and what language was characteristic of the organization's internal communications. The forged version was designed to pass as authentic to someone who knew the purported author well enough to recognize their voice, because the material used to construct it had been drawn from genuine sources. When a forged letter arrived at a rival organization's address, the recipient had no particular reason to question whether the signature on it corresponded to the person who had actually written it. A letter that reads as authentic on what appears to be authentic stationery, signed with a name the recipient recognizes, the default response to such a document is to treat it as what it claims to be. Hostility that followed, or meetings that were canceled, or alliances that did not form because of what a forged letter had apparently communicated, these outcomes appeared, from the outside, as the natural consequences of decisions made within communities that were being monitored. They did not appear as federal operations. The practical effect of operating across these three methods simultaneously, anonymous letters, embedded informants, and forged communications, was a kind of cumulative pressure on the internal life of targeted organizations. At any given moment, members might be receiving letters that accused colleagues of disloyalty, receiving guidance from someone whose actual employment was unknown to them, or responding to apparent communications from allied groups that had not in fact sent those communications. The organization's sense of its own integrity, its ability to know who was inside, who was trustworthy, and what had actually been said by whom, was the specific thing the methods were designed to disturb. This was not accidental. The internal language of the program's authorizing documents was explicit about the goal of disrupting unity, creating suspicion, and producing factionalism as ends in themselves. An organization that spent its energy managing internal distrust, investigating accusations, questioning its own records, and responding to apparent hostility from groups it had previously considered sympathetic, was an organization with less capacity for whatever its stated public work had been. That reduction in capacity was the operational objective. The letter the Bureau sent to Martin Luther King Jr. in November of 1964 was a specific and documented case of the anonymous letter method carried to a different purpose. What Bureau records and subsequent investigations established is that a package was prepared at FBI headquarters and mailed to King's home address. Inside were recordings made by hidden microphones placed in hotel rooms King had stayed in during his travels, along with a letter written in the simulated voice of a disillusioned insider, someone who appeared, from the letter's language, to be a fellow black activist who had learned something damaging and was compelled to share it. The letter, as investigators later characterized it after examining the text, contained a passage that referenced a deadline of approximately 34 days from the date it was sent. The timing corresponded to the ceremony at which King was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. The passage was interpreted by later investigators, including those who reviewed the material for congressional and academic inquiry, as urging King, in veiled language, to take his own life before that date. The framing was indirect, constructed to read as a communication from someone inside King's world, rather than as an official document from a federal agency, because that indirection was the operational premise of the method. The package was mailed from a city other than Washington to obscure its origin. It was addressed to King's home. It arrived during a period when he was traveling and was opened by his wife. These facts are recorded in the documents that emerged from later investigations and in the accounts of people who were present. What was in the package, the recordings, the letter, the implied deadline, is documented. The broader program of surveillance targeting King had been running for years before that package was sent. Wiretaps authorized by Attorney General Robert Kennedy in 1963 had been placed on King's home telephone and on several office lines, initially on national security grounds related to an alleged connection to a Communist Party advisor. The surveillance had expanded from there. By 1964, Bureau agents were recording not only telephone conversations, but the contents of hotel rooms King occupied while traveling for organizational and speaking work, the recordings made by microphones placed in the rooms either before or during his stays. This was, in operational terms, an extensive surveillance infrastructure attached to a single individual. The tapes produced by this infrastructure were, according to documents reviewed by congressional investigators, sometimes shared or described to journalists in the Bureau's orbit, with the apparent intent of damaging King's public standing and his relationships with other civil rights leaders, allies, and public figures. The hotel room recordings were the material sent in the November 1964 package. They had been gathered through a federal surveillance apparatus, processed through federal facilities, and then packaged and mailed as if they were contraband correspondence from a private individual with a grievance. It is worth staying with the structure of this for a moment, not its moral dimensions, which are available to anyone who reflects on them, but its operational structure. A federal agency gathering recordings of a private individual through covert surveillance. Those recordings then used as the material content of an anonymous mailing designed to appear as if it originated from a private source. The operational trail connecting the recordings to the mailing, existing only inside a classified federal filing system. To the person who received the package, or to any observer watching from outside, the transaction looked like private correspondence. There is a fourth category of method that deserves careful description. FBI field offices maintained working relationships with local police departments across Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and other major American cities, and in documented cases used these relationships to extend the program's reach beyond what the Bureau could accomplish through its own operations. Intelligence gathered through COINTELPRO surveillance was shared with local law enforcement. Lists of individuals were provided. In some documented instances, field offices communicated to local police departments specific pretexts under which searches or arrests might be made, the grounds framed as local enforcement matters for actions that served Bureau disruption goals. The result of this arrangement was that the program's methods could be translated into the language of ordinary police work. A search that was conducted on a pretext developed from FBI intelligence appeared in public record and in the official account of the local law enforcement agency as routine law enforcement activity. The Bureau's operational goals were achieved through a proxy, a local institution with its own chain of command, its own public accountability, and its own official justification for what it had done. The connection between the Bureau's surveillance and the local department's action was not recorded in any document that either institution needed to make available to outside review. This multiplication of reach through proxy institutions was not incidental to the program's design. The use of local law enforcement meant that the consequences of FBI intelligence could materialize in a form, a police raid, an arrest, a search of premises that had no visible federal fingerprint. The individuals or organizations affected might suspect federal involvement and have no means of establishing it. A community watching its members being arrested on charges that local police had developed could not, through ordinary channels of inquiry, trace those charges back to an FBI field office's targeting decisions. The operational distance between the Bureau's intelligence and the police department's action was, in this way, a feature of the arrangement rather than an accident of it. Each institution retained the appearance of acting independently within its own jurisdiction and mandate. The coordination that connected their actions existed in the same classified filing system where the program's other methods were recorded, the anonymous letters composed on the basis of intelligence reports, the informants sitting in organizational meetings and filing reports on private conversations, the forged letters prepared to appear as authentic communications from known figures, the anonymous package sent to a private address in November 1964, the intelligence shared with local police departments to be converted into the pretext for enforcement action. Each of these was documented. Each had its own internal authorization, its own routing slip, its own record of approval and execution. The program that contained them was not a loose collection of individual decisions made in isolation by agents acting without direction. It was administered. The field offices that carried out these operations submitted proposals to headquarters for review. Hoover's office approved or rejected individual operations. Agents composing anonymous letters were following authorized procedures. Informants were recruited, vetted, paid, and managed through established channels. The paperwork that surrounded each operation was maintained in the same classified system that held everything else, a record of the program's activity that was, for the years the program ran, available only to the people inside it. An agent completing a disruption operation would file a report describing the action taken and the expected outcome. The report would be reviewed by a supervisor and entered into the classified file. A follow-up might be assigned to assess whether the operation had produced the intended effect, whether the anonymous letter had generated the desired suspicion, whether the informant's influence on a specific organizational decision had moved that decision in the direction the Bureau preferred, whether the forged communication had produced the hostility between groups that the operation was designed to create. In this way, the program's activities were not merely carried out, but assessed. Internal evaluation of effectiveness was part of the administrative apparatus. Operations that were deemed successful informed the design of subsequent operations. Methods that had produced factionalism in one context were applied in analogous contexts in others. The techniques were developed, refined, and distributed through the internal communication channels that connected field offices to headquarters. The bureaucratic ordinariness of this process, proposals, approvals, operations, reports, assessments, is part of what makes the program's documented record feel, in retrospect, like such a peculiar thing to contemplate. The language of the internal documents is not the language of concealment in any simple sense. Agents described what they were doing accurately in field reports and memoranda in the specific technical vocabulary the program had developed for its methods. The concealment was structural, The system in which all of this accurate description was recorded was the same system that was invisible to any outside observer. A member of Congress requesting information about domestic FBI operations during the years the program ran would have been given no access to these documents. A journalist attempting to investigate rumors of Bureau misconduct would have had no mechanism to compel the production of classified internal files. A person who had received an anonymous letter or who suspected that a trusted colleague was filing reports on their private conversations had no means of locating the federal system in which that letter's composition or that colleague's instructions had been documented. The record existed. It was simply inside a boundary that for 15 years no external authority crossed. What the internal documents show, when read in sequence, is an administration of disruption as a continuous operational activity, not a single decision made once and executed uniformly, but a program that reviewed its own work, adjusted its methods, expanded its target list, and refined its techniques across the years it ran. The categories of method described in the program's authorizing language became over time a catalog of available options that field offices could propose and headquarters could approve. Anonymous letters for this situation, informants for that one, a forged communication when the goal was to produce hostility between two specific groups. The catalog was not fixed. New situations produced new proposals. Operations that failed to achieve their stated goals were noted and alternative approaches were authorized. The program adapted to the organizations it targeted. As those organizations changed, responding to shifts in leadership, alterations in strategy, expansions in membership, and the formation of new alliances among groups the Bureau was simultaneously monitoring. The specific fact of informants being used to participate in organizational decisions, rather than merely to observe them, represents a point on this adaptation. Observation produced intelligence. Active participation could produce operational outcomes, a decision made differently, an alliance not formed, a conflict intensified, without requiring any external action by the Bureau. The informant in the room was, in this function, less a reporter than an instrument. The intelligence that had been gathered about internal dynamics was being applied, through a person inside the organization, to shape those dynamics directly. What a targeted organization experienced, from inside, was the texture of its own internal life. Disagreements between members, concerns about leadership, suspicions about reliability, difficulties in maintaining coherent strategy in a period of external pressure. The fact that some portion of that texture had been engineered from outside by a federal agency with classified authorization was not visible from any vantage point available to the organization's members. This is, in some ways, the most structurally interesting aspect of the program's methods. The disruption they produced was largely invisible at its source. The effects were real and felt. A colleague's unexpected withdrawal, a leader suddenly under suspicion, an alliance that had seemed close until a letter arrived that changed the calculation, a police action that arrived without warning and appeared to emerge from local enforcement priorities. The federal program that had shaped any of these outcomes was, for the duration of the program's operation, not something any of the affected parties could point to, name, or bring into a courtroom. The classified filing system held all of it. Proposals and approvals, operational reports and follow-up assessments, payment records for informants, drafts of anonymous letters, notes on the preparation of forged documents, records of intelligence shared with local law enforcement. The program's own paperwork was, in one sense, its most precise record, a detailed account of what had been authorized, carried out, and evaluated, maintained in a system that kept the account invisible to the people the account described. The agent sitting at the desk with the intelligence report open in front of him, selecting language to compose an anonymous letter, was producing a document that would travel from a federal office into the ordinary postal system, arrive at a private address, and there do its work without any indication of the institutional machinery that had assembled it. The routing slips and approval memos that preceded the letter's composition would remain in the classified files. The field report that followed the letter's mailing would be added to the same system. The letter in the envelope would carry no stamp of origin that its recipient could examine. It would read as private correspondence, the kind of thing that passes between people who know each other and have something pressing to say. The federal nature of its composition, the intelligence basis for its specific personal claims, the authorized operational goal it was designed to serve. None of these were features visible on the page the recipient would hold and read. This gap between what an operation was and what it appeared to be was not incidental. It was the premise, an anonymous letter that could be traced to a federal field office would not have served its operational purpose. A forged communication on organizational stationery that could be identified as a forgery would not have produced the hostility it was designed to create. An informant who was known to the organization as a bureau asset would not have been able to sit in meetings and influence organizational decisions. The effectiveness of each method depended precisely on the invisibility of its origin. Local police departments in multiple cities received through their working relationships with FBI field offices information about individuals and organizations that the Bureau had developed through its surveillance operations. A list of names, intelligence about planned activities. In some documented cases, guidance on the grounds under which enforcement action might be justified. These departments were acting on information whose provenance was inside a federal classified system they had no formal accountability to disclose. Their actions, when they occurred, would appear in public record as local enforcement decisions, the product of local intelligence gathering and local operational planning. The program's methods, distributed across institutions in this way, left no single visible origin point. An anonymous letter had no return address. A forged document bore the name of someone who had not written it. An informant appeared to be a fellow member. A police action seemed to emerge from local law enforcement priorities. The classified federal filing system that connected all of these to a single program, a single chain of command, and a single set of authorizing documents was not a system that any outside observer during the program's active years had the means to open and read. The routing slips and the filed reports and the approval memos and the payment records and the operational assessments, all of this material continued to accumulate in the Bureau's classified filing system across the 15 years the program ran. Field offices around the country, submitting proposals and receiving approvals, filing reports on completed operations, and awaiting assessments of their effectiveness, were generating a detailed and continuous record. The record was accurate in the sense that it described what the agents had actually done. It was simply held inside a boundary that moved with the program wherever the program moved, keeping the full account of the program's activities available only to the institutional system that had produced it. And in cities across the country, in the weeks and months and years that followed each operation, members of targeted organizations went about their work inside communities whose texture had been, in ways none of them could see or verify, shaped by the methods that the filing system described. Suspicions that had been planted, alliances that had been fractured, Leaders whose standing had been quietly reduced through letters no one in the organization had written, a community's internal life, carrying the marks of an external intervention that had arrived without any visible address. The list of local police departments that had received FBI intelligence during these years was not a public document. The names of the informants who had attended the meetings were not recorded in any register available to the organizations they had joined. The drafts of the anonymous letters had not been retained in a place accessible to the people who had received them. The routing slips bearing the signatures of agents who had approved the operations had not been filed in a system any outside authority was then empowered to review. Multiple cities, multiple field offices, multiple years of proposals and approvals and operations and reports. The program's own paperwork, accumulated across its operation, formed a record of institutional activity that was, by any administrative measure, extensive. It sat in the same quiet federal architecture that held everything else the Bureau considered classified, available, for the duration of the program's operation, to no one outside the institution that had produced it. A hand-drawn floor plan of an apartment at 2337 West Monroe Street in Chicago traveled, in the weeks before December of 1969, from the hands of the person who made it to the hands of the person who received it. The document showed the interior layout of a specific residence, rooms indicated by their position relative to one another, doorways marked, a bedroom noted by its location within the structure. It was the kind of diagram that conveys not just the shape of a space, but the particular usefulness of knowing where someone sleeps. William O'Neill had drawn it. He was 23 years old, working as the director of security for the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and he had been working as a paid FBI informant since 1966, when he was recruited after an arrest. His handler was Special Agent Roy Mitchell, and the payment records filed by the FBI's Chicago field office documented, among other entries, a bonus of $300 paid to O'Neill in the period surrounding December 4th, 1969. The floor plan O'Neill provided was specific enough to indicate the location of Fred Hampton's bedroom within the apartment. Fred Hampton was 21 years old in December of 1969. He was the chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party's chapter, and in the months and years before that winter, he had been building something the FBI's internal documents assessed with particular attention. The organization Hampton had been constructing in Chicago, which he called the Rainbow Coalition, was a multiracial alliance that brought together organizations that might otherwise have had no common ground. The Young Patriots Organization, a group whose membership was drawn largely from poor white Appalachian migrants living in Chicago's uptown neighborhood, had joined. The Young Lords, a Puerto Rican activist organization rooted in the city's Lincoln Park neighborhood, had joined. The framework Hampton proposed was one organized around class, around the material conditions of poverty, rather than around any single community's particular identity, and FBI and police documents from that period indicate that this framework was assessed as a high-priority organizational threat. The Rainbow Coalition was not, in the FBI's internal language, considered dangerous because it was violent. The Bureau's own records from the Chicago field office during this period characterized the threat in terms that are recognizably political: concern about Hampton's organizing effectiveness, his ability to form unexpected alliances, the reach of his influence among young people across different communities in the city. The specific combination of political sophistication and cross-community organizing is the quality that the documents return to with some regularity. Hampton had been speaking publicly and working organizationally in Chicago for only a few years, and in that time he had become, in the Bureau's own recorded estimation, something that required sustained attention. The program that had generated that attention had by late 1969 been operating for 13 years. Its methods by that point were practiced. The anonymous letters, the informants positioned inside organizations, the forged documents, the intelligence shared with local law enforcement. The Chicago field office was among the most active in the country in the application of those methods, and William O'Neill was among the most embedded informants the office was running. His position as director of security inside the Illinois chapter meant that his access was not peripheral. He was present in the organization's internal deliberations. He was trusted by the people he was reporting on, and in the weeks before December 4th, 1969, he provided the floor plan that showed exactly where Fred Hampton's bedroom was within the apartment on West Monroe Street. The apartment building stood in a neighborhood on the city's west side. The address was 2337 West Monroe Street, and several members of the Illinois chapter lived there. On the night of December 3rd, moving into the early hours of December 4th, Fred Hampton was at home. Accounts from survivors and from the forensic record established later indicate that Hampton had fallen asleep in his bedroom. One account from a witness present that night described Hampton as unusually difficult to rouse, and questions about whether O'Neill had placed something in Hampton's drink earlier that evening were raised during subsequent legal proceedings, though what was established by the documentary record and what remained in the range of contested claims were distinguished from one another in those proceedings without full resolution on that specific point. What the forensic record did establish, with considerable specificity, concerned the physical facts of what happened in the apartment in the early morning hours of December 4th, 1969. A 14-person tactical unit operating under the authority of Cook County State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan arrived at the apartment before dawn. The raid began with movement into the front room of the apartment, where Mark Clark, a 22-year-old leader of the Peoria chapter of the Black Panther Party, who was present at the apartment that night, was killed almost immediately. The physical evidence examined by independent forensic analysts indicated that Clark had been shot once, and that the single shot recovered from his direction was consistent with a reflexive discharge from a weapon Clark held at the moment he was shot. In the bedroom where Fred Hampton slept, the forensic record established through independent analysis and documented in the legal proceedings that followed was specific about trajectory and proximity. Hampton was struck by 2 bullets fired at close range into his head. The precise reconstruction of those shots, their angles, the physical evidence of the positions from which they were fired, formed a substantial portion of the independent forensic analysis commissioned by attorneys representing the victims' families in the years after the raid. The question of who was shooting at whom and in what proportion was not left ambiguous by that forensic record. State's Attorney Hanrahan, in the days immediately following the raid, made a public presentation characterizing the incident as a two-way firefight, as a situation in which the occupants of the apartment had opened fire on the officers who entered. He distributed photographs to newspapers. He gave statements to the press that framed the raid as a law enforcement operation met with deadly resistance. The independent forensic analysis that was commissioned separately and that examined the same physical evidence found something that did not align with that framing. Of approximately 90 to 99 shots fired during the raid, the analysts found that only one could be attributed to weapons belonging to the Panthers. The ballistics work was detailed and specific, and its conclusions entered the public record through the legal processes that followed in the years after the raid. The legal processes took years. They took more than a decade, in fact, which is itself a fact worth sitting with for a moment. The way time accumulates around a single night and keeps accumulating long after that night is over. The civil lawsuit that would eventually reach a settlement was filed in 1970, the same year the raid had occurred. It moved through the federal court system across the 1970s, a process that generated through the mechanisms of civil discovery thousands of pages of FBI documents that had not previously been available for public examination. Discovery is a legal process by which parties to a lawsuit can compel the production of documents held by the other side. In civil litigation against the federal government and against local government entities, discovery can reach into filing systems that have been closed to outside view. The lawsuit filed in the aftermath of the December 4th raid eventually compelled the production of FBI documents from the Chicago field office, documents that included O'Neill's reports, the communications between the Chicago office and FBI headquarters, and materials that documented the coordination between the Bureau's intelligence operations and the tactical planning that preceded the raid. Those documents did not emerge all at once or cleanly. They emerged across years of litigation, filing and counterfiling, and in some cases through court orders compelling production that the government initially resisted. What they showed, taken together, was a chain of operational coordination. The floor plan, the payment records, the communications between the field office and headquarters, the documentation of O'Neill's role, and the assessments his handlers had filed, all of it was in the record by the time the litigation approached its conclusion. The picture that emerged from those thousands of pages was one in which the December 4th raid had been shaped, in specific and documented ways, by the FBI's intelligence operation running inside the Illinois chapter, and by the information that operation had produced. The coordination between the FBI and the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in the period preceding the raid was documented in the materials that emerged through discovery. The Bureau's Chicago field office had shared intelligence from its surveillance and infiltration of the Illinois chapter with Hanrahan's office. This kind of intelligence sharing, the Bureau providing information to a local law enforcement entity, and the local entity acting on it, was one of the established methods of the broader program. It allowed federal resources and federal intelligence to produce operational results through a local agency, the visible face of any subsequent action being a local police or prosecutorial body, rather than the FBI itself. The building where all of this arrived, the courtroom, the settlement table, was, in a quiet way, a different kind of document repository than a federal filing cabinet. What was established in federal civil litigation entered a different kind of record than an internal memorandum. A settlement, and the discovery record that preceded it, existed in a federal legal docket. It could be cited, examined, retrieved. The materials that had been classified and filed inside the Bureau's own system had, through the pressure of litigation, moved into a form of the record that was accessible in a way classiphiles were not. In 1982, after more than a decade of civil litigation, the federal government, the city of Chicago, and Cook County agreed to a settlement. The sum was $1,850,000 to be divided among the survivors of the raid and the families of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. The settlement was reached without any admission of wrongdoing by any of the governmental defendants. This is a feature of many civil settlements involving governmental entities, the resolution of the legal claim without a concession that the actions described in the complaint were wrongful. The legal process had produced, through discovery, a record of what the documents said. The settlement closed the litigation without requiring any party to formally acknowledge what that record showed. Fred Hampton's family received a portion of that settlement. His mother, Iberia Hampton, had been among those who pursued the legal case through its full duration. The litigation had moved through federal courts for 12 years before arriving at that table. 12 years is a long time for a legal matter to persist, long enough for the political landscape around it to shift several times, long enough for the investigative and journalistic record of what had happened to accumulate alongside the legal record, long enough for the documents produced through discovery to be read, analyzed, and entered into the broader historical account. The apartment building at 2337 West Monroe Street stood in a neighborhood that, like many West Side Chicago neighborhoods, changed considerably across those 12 years. The physical location of the events of December 4th, 1969, continued to exist in the city as a place, buildings age, neighborhoods change around them. The legal proceedings concerned with that address were being pursued in federal courts, while the address itself continued to be a place in a city where people lived. There is a particular quality to the forensic record of a single night, the way it accumulates specificity over years of examination. The independent ballistics analysis, commissioned by attorneys for the Hampton and Clark families, was conducted by investigators who examined the physical evidence that had been gathered from the apartment. Bullet trajectories, the positions of walls and doorways as indicated by damage patterns, the locations where shell casings were found. These are the materials from which a forensic account of a night is assembled. The account assembled from those materials in the Hampton and Clark case was, in its conclusions about the proportion of shooting attributable to different parties, specific and documented. It entered the public record through the legal proceedings and through subsequent journalistic and historical treatment of the case. The state's attorney's public presentation of the raid had begun with photographs, images distributed to newspapers in the days immediately following December 4th, framed as evidence of the two-way firefight his office described. In the years that followed, the specific claims in that public presentation were examined against the forensic record in detail. The gap between the initial public framing and what the independent ballistics analysis found was one of the things that sustained the litigation and contributed to the legal and political pressure that the case generated across the 1970s. Edward Hanrahan's political career did not persist unchanged through the period of the litigation. He ran for re-election as state's attorney in 1972 and lost, with the December 4th raid and its aftermath playing a role in the circumstances of that loss. The careers of public figures are shaped by many things simultaneously, and the specific weight to assign any single event and a political outcome is not something that the documentary record resolves cleanly. What is in the record is that Hanrahan's office had conducted the raid, that the forensic record contradicted the office's public account of what had happened, and that the case remained a matter of legal and public attention throughout the period in which he was seeking continued office. The FBI's Chicago field office continued to operate through those years. The specific agent who had been O'Neill's handler, Roy Mitchell, was at various points a named subject of the litigation and of congressional and journalistic inquiry into the events of December 4th. William O'Neill himself moved through the years after the raid in ways that were, by his own accounts given in later interviews, not uncomplicated. He gave an interview that was included in a documentary film produced in 1990 in which he spoke about his role in the events surrounding the raid. The interview was recorded in the early hours of January 15, 1990. The same evening the documentary was broadcast, O'Neill died. The manner of his death was ruled a suicide. He was 43 years old. The documentary had been broadcast earlier that same night. What O'Neill described in that interview, his recruitment, his role, his provision of the floor plan, became part of the public record at a moment when he was no longer present to add to or qualify what he had said. The documentary in which his interview appeared was a film about Fred Hampton and the events of December 4th, 1969. The interview sat within a larger structure of testimony and historical account, and O'Neill's own words about what he had done and what he had known are among the documented materials that concern the events of that night. The floor plan he had drawn is not a document that survives in isolation. It exists within a larger file, the FBI's Chicago field office, records related to its operations against the Illinois Black Panther Party chapter that includes the payment records, the intelligence reports O'Neill filed with his handlers, the communications between the field office and FBI headquarters, and the materials exchanged between the Bureau's office and Hanrahan's office. These materials, much of which was produced through the discovery process in the civil litigation, are part of the documentary record that the legal proceedings of the 1970s and early 1980s brought into the accessible record. The civil settlement of 1982 resolved the legal claim, but left the documentary record open in the sense that the documents themselves continued to exist and to be available for examination. A settlement does not seal the record of a case in the way a national security classification might. The discovery materials generated through 12 years of federal litigation remained part of the legal record, accessible to researchers, journalists, and subsequent legal or investigative processes. There is a particular quality to what the documentary record of the Hampton and Clark case demonstrates about the program it belongs to. The floor plan is a document that connects the interior of an intelligence operation, the informant, the handler, the field office, to a physical outcome in a specific place at a specific time. Most of the program's documented operations produced outcomes that were more diffuse, a targeted organization weakened by internal suspicion, a leader's public reputation damaged by a fabricated or exaggerated claim, a coalition disrupted by a forged letter that arrived at the wrong address. The events of December 4th, 1969 produced a different kind of outcome, and the specificity of what occurred on that night, the floor plan, the pre-dawn hour, the forensic evidence of where the shots came from, made the connection between the operation's inputs and its results more traceable than many other instances within the program's 15-year run. The Rainbow Coalition that Hampton had been building did not survive December 4th, 1969, in its existing form. The alliance he had constructed, the Young Patriots, the Young Lords, the cross-community framework organized around class, dispersed in the period after his death. The FBI's own internal assessments from before the raid had identified the coalition as a particular kind of organizational threat, precisely because of its potential to bridge communities that had not previously been organized together. Whether the coalition would have grown or faltered for its own internal reasons is not something the record can establish, because the record of what it became was interrupted before that question had time to answer itself. The political landscape of Chicago in 1969 was not one that existed outside of history. The city had in 1968 been the site of the Democratic National Convention and the police violence against protesters outside it. The tensions between Chicago's law enforcement establishments and various activist communities in the city were not abstract. Hanrahan's office operated within a specific political context in which the state's attorney's relationship to Mayor Richard J. Daley's administration shaped the resources and priorities of the office. The FBI's relationship to local law enforcement in Chicago, as documented through discovery, was one in which intelligence flowed from the Bureau to the local agencies, and operational action was taken by those agencies. A structure that had the effect of multiplying the program's reach while distributing the visible responsibility for any particular action across more than one institution. This distribution of responsibility was one of the structural features of the program's operations more broadly. When an anonymous letter was sent by an FBI agent, the Bureau's authorship was invisible. When local police acted on intelligence provided by the Bureau's field office, the raid or the arrest appeared as local law enforcement activity. The mechanics of the program were designed, in many of its operational applications, to produce effects without a visible federal origin. The floor plan and the payment records that emerged through litigation documented a case in which the connection between federal intelligence operations and a local law enforcement action was more traceable than most, and that traceability was what the 12 years of civil litigation eventually brought into the record. December 4th, 1969 existed in the calendar alongside other events of that year. The program that had generated the operations connected to that night had been running since 1956. It would formally be designated as terminated in 1971, 2 years after the night in question. The formal termination did not dissolve the cases already in the record or the litigation already in progress. The lawsuits are not dismissed by the termination of the program that produced the events they concern. The Hampton and Clark case moved through the federal courts for a decade after the program's formal end. The specific figure of the settlement, $1,850,000, is a number that entered the legal record as a resolution without being a finding. A settlement is a negotiated agreement to end litigation. WSBI carries legal weight in the sense of being binding on the parties, and it is recorded in the federal docket, but it does not carry the evidentiary weight of a verdict or a judicial finding of fact. The government defendants settled without admitting that the raid had been conducted wrongfully, or that the FBI's coordination with Hanrahan's office had been improper, or that the use of O'Neill's intelligence in the planning of the operation had been unlawful. What the documents they obtained through it, are part of what is now in the historical record. An apartment at 2337 West Monroe Street, a floor plan showing where a bedroom was, a pre-dawn hour on December 4th, 1969, a ballistics record establishing where the shots came from, a civil lawsuit filed the following year, and 12 years of federal litigation producing thousands of pages of documents. These are the specific documented elements of the case that the record contains. They exist in a particular relationship to one another that the litigation's discovery process made visible, and that the historical record has since carried forward in the form that such records take. Legal documents, forensic reports, journalistic accounts, academic histories, and the interview that William O'Neill gave on the last night of his life. The settlement table in 1982 was, in one sense, the end of the legal proceeding. In another sense, it was simply the point at which a particular kind of examination stopped producing new documents. The documents that had already been produced did not stop existing when the litigation closed. They entered the archives and the libraries and the journalistic and academic record, where they have continued to be read and cited and examined by researchers working to understand what the program's operations produced in specific places at specific times. The early morning hours of December 4th, 1969, in Chicago, are a documented historical event. The documentary record of that night, the floor plan, the payment records, the ballistics analysis, the litigation that followed, is one of the most extensively examined, specific instances within the broader history of a program that operated for 15 years and produced records that run to tens of thousands of pages. The single night in Chicago exists within that larger record and is also in the detail and specificity of what was documented about it, something that can be held and examined on its own terms. A lawsuit filed in a federal court in 1970 moved through the legal system for 12 years, accumulating in its passage a documentary record of the night it concerned. The record arrived in 1982 at a settlement that resolved the legal claim and preserved the documents. Those documents remained, after the settlement, in the places where they had come to rest: federal legal files, the records of attorneys who had worked the case, the collections of journalists and historians who had followed it, the FBI's own files that had been compelled into disclosure through discovery. The case was closed. The documents were not. On the night of March 8, 1971, the FBI's field office in Media, Pennsylvania, was quiet in the way that small administrative buildings are quiet after hours. The desks cleared, the overhead lights off, the filing cabinets standing in the dark, in the particular stillness of a room that holds paper. Approximately 8 people entered that building that night. What they removed before they left was roughly 1,000 documents. Within days, photocopies of those documents had reached the desks of journalists and the offices of members of Congress. Among the words that appeared in newsprint for the first time, pulled from the language of those internal files, was a single capitalized compound, COINTELPRO. Most readers who saw it had no prior framework for it. The program it named had been running for 15 years. The group that carried out the break-in called itself the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI. Nothing about that name appeared in any prior public record. The members of the group told no one who they were. In the years that followed, as the documents they had removed circulated and were examined and reported on, the question of who had taken them remained open. It remained open for a long time. The statute of limitations on the break-in expired years before anyone with first-hand knowledge spoke publicly. It was not until 2014 that several members of the group, including a man named John Raines and a woman named Bonnie Raines, identified themselves in interviews, the legal exposure that had kept them silent having passed entirely by then. For more than 4 decades, the people who had put the word COINTELPRO into public view had simply remained private citizens, their names absent from the record they had created. The documents themselves did not arrive in newsrooms with explanations. They arrived as raw bureaucratic text, internal memoranda, routing slips, operational summaries written in the measured administrative register of an institution that had never expected those pages to be read by anyone outside its own chain of command. Journalists who received them had to build the context gradually, working from the language the documents used to describe what they were doing and why. The word COINTELPRO appeared as a program designation in files that described operations against named organizations. The files did not read as confessions. They read as records of ordinary institutional business, which was in its own way a more interesting kind of document than a confession would have been. In the months following the media break-in, reporting on the documents produced a growing public awareness that something structured and deliberate had been operating inside the Bureau. The scale of that something remained unclear. The documents removed from media were a sample, a single field office's holdings, not the complete archive of a program that had run across the country. What those documents pointed toward was considerably larger than what they contained. Congressional interest, which had been limited before, began to sharpen. What moved slowly at first began to move faster after a separate and much larger institutional rupture arrived 4 years later, in a different season, in a Senate hearing room in Washington. Senator Frank Church of Idaho had been watching the gradual public emergence of material about domestic intelligence operations since at least 1971. By late 1974, with the political climate significantly altered by events that had nothing directly to do with COINTELPRO, conditions had arrived that made a full congressional investigation possible in a way they had not been before. In January of 1975, the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities held its first session. Church chaired the committee. The investigation that followed was, by the measure of its documentary scope, unlike anything Congress had previously attempted in this area. Over the course of its work, the Church Committee conducted more than 800 interviews. It held 250 executive sessions, closed hearings where witnesses spoke on the record in circumstances that protected classified material from immediate public disclosure. The documents the committee reviewed, pulled from FBI files through the mechanism of congressional subpoena, numbered approximately 14,000 pages of COINTELPRO-related material alone, with the operational record of 15 years of domestic intelligence activities spread across field offices and routed through headquarters in Washington. The investigators who read those pages were working through material that had never been subject to any external review during the years the program was active. No court had seen it. No attorney general had been given a systematic account of it. The committee was, in a real sense, reading a history of an institution that had kept its own record with considerable care and kept that record to itself. What the 14,000 pages described was not a single operation or a single period. The documents covered the full span from 1956 through 1971, with activity across multiple simultaneous subprograms targeting organizations that shared almost nothing except the Bureau's assessment of them as threats. The field office reports, the headquarters responses, the payment records, the operational summaries, all of it had been filed in the standard administrative manner of a large government agency, organized and retrievable. The disruption of domestic political organizations recorded in the same language and the same filing systems used for everything else the Bureau did. Reading through it required time. The committee took that time. The Church Committee's final report was issued in 1976. It ran to 14 volumes, produced across the 18 months of the investigation's active work. The formal conclusions it reached about COINTELPRO were stated in the measured language of congressional findings, which is a particular kind of language, specific enough to carry legal weight, restrained enough to reflect the evidentiary standard the committee had tried to hold itself to. What the report found, stated plainly, was that COINTELPRO operations had violated the constitutional rights of American citizens on a systematic basis over 15 years. The First Amendment, which protects speech and association. The Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment, which protects due process. The Sixth Amendment, which protects the right to a fair trial. The violations were not found to be occasional or incidental. The report characterized them as systematic, the product of deliberate program design rather than individual agent misconduct. The report also found that the program had been deliberately concealed from the successive attorneys general who served during its operation and from successive presidents. The chain of accountability that ought to have connected a domestic intelligence program to the executive officials formally responsible for it had been, in the committee's finding, intentionally broken. The program had been run by the Bureau as a self-contained operation, accountable internally and not externally for the full duration of its 15 years. This finding about concealment was, in its own way, as significant as the findings about constitutional violations, because it described not just what the program had done, but how it had arranged to continue doing it by remaining invisible to the people who might have stopped it. The question of what should follow such findings occupied the committee, and then the Congress, and then the executive branch, through the years immediately after the report. Some of what was proposed became policy. Some of what was proposed was never enacted. The distinction between those two outcomes is in itself part of the record. In April of 1976, Attorney General Edward Levi issued written guidelines for FBI domestic security investigations. The guidelines were the first formally binding written rules of this kind, the first time the Bureau's authority to conduct domestic intelligence operations had been bounded in writing by anything outside the Bureau itself. What the Levi guidelines required in their essential structure was that FBI domestic security investigations be grounded in specific and articulable facts suggesting criminal activity. The Bureau could not, under the guidelines, open an investigation of an organization or individual on the basis of political beliefs or associations alone. The belief that someone held certain views or associated with people who held certain views was not, under the new standard, sufficient grounds for opening a domestic intelligence file. The Levi guidelines were administrative in their legal status. They were not a statute. Congress had not passed them into law. They were a formal policy document issued by an attorney general, which meant they carried the full weight of executive authority for as long as that authority chose to maintain them, and could be revised, amended, or replaced by any future attorney general who found a reason to do so without any requirement to return to Congress for approval. This quality of the guidelines was noted at the time and has been noted in accounts of the post-COINTELPRO period written since. What they established was real. How durably it was established was a different and less settled question. The proposed legislative charter for the FBI, a statutory framework that would have embedded the guideline standards in law rather than leaving them to administrative discretion, was among the Church Committee's formal recommendations. The committee had found that the FBI operated without a congressional charter, without a statutory definition of its domestic intelligence authority, and without any legislated limit on how that authority could be used. The recommendation to remedy this through legislation was specific and detailed. The legislative charter was drafted, it was debated, it was never enacted. The gap between what the committee recommended and what Congress passed in the years following the report is part of the documentary record of the period, noted in academic and legal assessments of post-COINTELPRO reform with consistent regularity in the decades since. What did pass was a different kind of statutory change. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 1978 created a specialized court to oversee government requests for surveillance warrants in national security cases. The court, called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, operated in closed session with proceedings protected from public disclosure. But it was a court. Judges reviewed warrant applications. The government had to make a case before a judicial authority before surveillance could proceed under its terms. The judicial check that had been entirely absent during the COINTELPRO years existed after 1978 in at least this form. It was not the full legislative framework the Church Committee had envisioned. It was a specific and consequential piece of what had been envisioned, installed in the law and operating from the year of its passage forward. What the post-COINTELPRO period produced, taken together, was a layered and uneven set of changes, some statutory, some administrative, some simply documentary. The documentation itself had weight. The 14,000 pages that committee investigators had read through, the 14 volumes of findings that the committee had published, the full public record of the investigation. All of this entered the permanent archive of American political history in a form that was available to be read by anyone who wanted to read it. The fact of the program's existence, the fact of its methods, the fact of its targets, and the fact of its constitutional violations had been stated in a congressional report and could not be unstated. The identity of the people most directly touched by the program's operations and the organizations whose internal functioning had been disrupted by its methods had also entered the public record through the civil litigation that ran alongside and after the congressional investigation. The Socialist Workers' Party's federal lawsuit, filed in the years following the media document's publication, moved through the courts for more than a decade. The discovery process that the lawsuit required produced its own documentary record. FBI files subpoenaed and produced in a federal courtroom, operational details entered into the legal proceedings. The paper trail of more than 20,000 days of surveillance appearing in court filings that were themselves public documents. When the case reached resolution in 1986, the federal court ruling that awarded the party $264,000 in damages was itself a document, a judicial finding that specified, with the precision courts require, what had been done and over what period. Civil litigation was not the only mechanism by which the record was built. The Freedom of Information Act, amended and strengthened in 1974, partly in response to the revelations of the period, created a legal pathway through which individuals, journalists, and researchers could request FBI and other federal agency files on themselves or on organizations. Requests filed under the Act produced, over the years following its strengthening, a continuing stream of released documents that added detail to the picture the committee's investigation had sketched. Some of what was released came heavily redacted, large sections blacked out under exemptions the Act permitted. Some came in a form that added specific operational details that had not been part of the committee's public findings. The released files, taken together with the committee's 14 volumes, with the civil litigation records, and with the journalistic accounts built from all of these, constituted a body of primary source material that grew across the years following the program's exposure and continued to be added to. The researchers who worked with this material in the decades after the Church Committee report were working in a landscape that the committee's investigation had, in a real sense, made possible. Before 1971, the documents did not exist in any form accessible to outside examination. After the media break-in, a sample did. After the Church Committee investigation, the structure of the program existed in a formal public finding. After the civil litigation of the 1970s and 1980s, specific operational details existed in court records. After the Freedom of Information Act requests that accumulated across those same decades, additional file material was available in reading rooms and in the collections of institutions that had sought and received it. University archives at institutions including the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Tamiment Library at New York University built collections of primary source material related to COINTELPRO and the organizations it targeted. FBI files, legal documents, organizational records from groups that had been under surveillance, oral history interviews with people who had direct experience of the program's effects. The materials were cataloged and shelved in the manner of archival collections everywhere, folders numbered and labeled, finding aids produced to help researchers locate specific documents, the material available on any given morning to a person who arrived and asked to see it. Academic work drawing on these collections appeared in journals and books across the 1980s, 1990s, and afterward each study adding another layer of documented understanding to what had already been formally established. The legal framework produced by the post-COINTELPRO period continued to be examined, tested, and debated in legal scholarship through the decades that followed. The Levi Guidelines were modified by subsequent attorneys general. The question of what statutory protections existed for domestic political organizations and what limits on federal domestic intelligence authority had genuine legal durability remained a subject of serious scholarly attention rather than a settled matter. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, established in 1978, became the subject of its own substantial body of scholarship as its scope of operations developed over the years. The gap where a legislative charter for the FBI had been recommended but not enacted continued to be noted in assessments of the reform period as a structural absence in the legal landscape the period had produced. What the scholars, the litigants, the journalists, and the archivists were working with beneath all the interpretive layers that had accumulated over the decades was paper, internal memoranda and routing documents, payment records and operational summaries, court filings and congressional testimony, archived organizational newspapers, and filed informant reports. The program had been run on paper, in the administrative manner of a large institution that kept careful records. The records had been held in classified filing systems for 15 years. They had entered the public world through a break-in in a small Pennsylvania city, through congressional subpoena, through civil discovery, through Freedom of Information Act requests filed over many years. Once out, they had been read by journalists, by lawyers, by congressional investigators, by academic historians, by archivists who cataloged them for future readers. The reading had been going on for decades. It continued to go on. There is a particular quality to a primary source document that has moved from a classified federal filing cabinet to an archival folder in a university reading room. The physical object has traveled a considerable distance, institutional, legal, historical, between those two locations. The language of the document does not change. An internal FBI memorandum written in 1964 uses the same words in a university folder that it used in the Bureau's files. What changes is who is permitted to read it, and under what circumstances, and for what purpose. In a university reading room, anyone with a research interest and a library card can sit down with the folder and read what the document says. The bureaucratic language that was written for internal routing becomes, in that context, something that can be examined from the outside, at whatever distance and with whatever frame the reader brings to it. The distance that time produces is its own kind of frame. The 15 years of COINTELPRO's operation ended more than 5 decades ago. The Church Committee investigation concluded nearly 50 years ago. The civil lawsuits that produced additional documentary records were resolved in the 1980s. The people who were direct participants in the program, agents, handlers, informants, program targets, their families, have, many of them, moved through the full arc of adult lives since those years. Some have died. Some have spoken at length on the record about what they did or experienced or witnessed. Some have not spoken. The oral record that exists alongside the documentary record was built from those who chose or were persuaded to speak, and is as incomplete as oral records always are. What persists, and what will continue to persist, is the written record, the filed memoranda and the court rulings, the congressional findings, and the archived organizational documents, the Freedom of Information Act releases, and the academic studies built from all of the above. These exist in the form that documents exist in, which is to say, they can be found, located, requested, and read by anyone who has a reason to look for them. The archival folders at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Tamiment Library are not the only repositories. The National Archives holds its own material. The FBI's own records, released in portions through Freedom of Information Act processes, constitute a primary source of considerable volume. Local libraries in cities where the program's operations were concentrated sometimes hold relevant municipal records and newspaper archives from the period. A researcher arriving at any of these reading rooms on a given morning would find the same thing that researchers have been finding since the collections were built: folders of paper, filed in order, available on request. The documents are not hidden. They have been, since the various processes of their emergence into public view were completed, simply present in the particular quiet way that archival material is present, available to whoever comes looking, indifferent to whether anyone comes at all. This is the quality that the post-COINTELPRO record shares with most of the documentary history that accumulates in institutional archives over time. It does not announce itself. It does not seek readers out. It sits in its folders and waits, in the unhurried way of paper, for the people who come with questions to sit down and begin reading. Some weeks, those people are many. Some weeks, the reading rooms are quieter. The documents are unchanged by either. They hold what they held when they were filed, which is the specific factual content of a specific institutional history, written down in the period it describes, preserved in the period that followed, and available in the present to anyone whose interest leads them there. The word COINTELPRO appeared in a newspaper for the first time in the days after March 8, 1971.